So I guess we're ready to roll. So Senate Agricultural Committee. It's Thursday morning, March 21st. And we're going to be taking some testimony in regards to the repair bill that we have in our committee. Uh, So the first witness we have this morning is former Senator Chris Pearson. And good morning, Chris, and welcome.
Good
And
morning, Mr. Chair members. Nice to see you all.
yeah, and I think you know us all, so we won't bother to introduce ourselves unless you forgot.
No. How could I forget the four of you? Come on.
Yeah, it'd be
And
a
as
hard thing to forget. Wouldn't it? So anyways, we don't wanna tie you up, any longer than we have to and um, give us your thoughts in regards to H 81.
I'd be glad to, and I really was touched to have Linda reach out. I don't have a particular stake in this bill other than I had introduced earlier versions of it in the Senate, and pleased to say since then, other states have adopted different pieces of this puzzle. In the Vermont history, we did run a task force trying to dig into some of these issues because it can come across as complicated. And so I'm happy to share a few of the lessons and takeaways from that. I guess I should say Chris Pearson from Burlington, former member of the legislature and currently not at all in the legislature. Enjoying every minute of that. For me, uh, I guess as I think about this and as I talk about it, I will probably shift between different pieces of equipment. And I know your bill is limited in talking about forestry and ag equipment, and I think that's a great place to start. And I think it has incredible value in our rural state and in particularly in the most rural areas of our state. But the issues are the same, whether we're talking about my cell phone, a computer, a coffee maker, or a tractor or a skidder or something. And that is just fundamentally, I own this piece of equipment. It is mine. I'm not leasing it. I might be paying it off, but it is mine. And fundamentally, I ought to be able to do what I want with it. And that could include taking it to my friend that's knowledgeable about it, taking it to an independent repair person when the screen cracks or when the battery poops out. And I ought to be able to do that, and I ought to be able to assume the risk of doing that, and I ought to be able to establish whether it's my own habit and hobby or paying somebody else. I ought to be able to establish that right just fundamentally, and I take the risk. That's what is going on in a free market economy. And if my repairman is lousy, you would assume they would fall out of business. And at the heart of this are really some old-fashioned skills. The very skills that we often lament are being lost, right? Is the ability to be independent, to be in that Vermont sense, very frugal, take care of ourselves. I'm willing to bet, Mr. Chair, that the Star Farm and maybe the Judd Farm, two of the farms I'm aware of up your way, when a tractor broke down, people would come from the neighboring farm and fix it, or there was somebody that you knew locally who could help you if you didn't have the skills right on the farm, right? We had, in a sense, it's old fashioned, but it is a self-reliance. And we're watching those skills fade. And it is not an accident, and it has everything to do with this bill, and it has everything to do with the state of our economy right now. And I think about, like, I'm not particularly skilled, but when my washing machine breaks down, you can bet I'm looking to see if there's a gasket that I can replace for $8. And we know full well that oftentimes that works. And we know full well that the industry would rather you just don't ask questions, throw away your washing machine and buy a new one. Right. And that is not an accident, and it's not a coincidence, and it's exactly related to the bill in front of you. And so they dress it up in all sorts of mythology. But this is really the fundamentals of this. And in various variations of this language have been on the ballot in Massachusetts and Maine. So we don't have to wonder what voters think about it. In those two states, it was related to automobiles. And the voters came back, and I think it was twice in Massachusetts. Like it was, I want to say 84 or 86% support, similar results in Maine. I mean, Mr. Chair, even you, when you run uncontested, you probably don't get over 85% of the vote, right? I mean, that is a strong sentiment. So we know where voters are on this. And we know that at its foundation, this is just a fairness sort of piece of equity of fundamentally, I own my coffee maker. If I want to try and fix it, I should be able to. And if a repair shop wants to be able to fix it, they should be able to. And if I have to bring it to Black and Decker because that repair shop is the only place that will be sold the right part by Black and Decker's, higher ups, well, then they're selling that. They're just picking who to sell it to. And this is saying we ought to have that be opened up. People can take responsibility, and they can also take the risk themselves. It's not a slam dunk that I'll be able to fix it, but that's on me to figure out. And when you're talking about people, when we're talking about professional equipment, whether it's in the fields or in the woods for foresters, even more remote, you're talking about dollars and cents. These people are waiting for weeks to have the authorized person come and plug in their computer before they can, oh my God, do anything. In some cases, replacing filters or replacing a gasket that is trivial in cost and costing them time. And that's a particular issue for us because we're far away from oftentimes those professionals that are authorized to do it. So there's truly a cost here. I'll say, as I've debated this and been involved in it over the years, there are several myths that pop up, and I just want to cover them a little bit that I recall, because frankly, they're all ridiculous. But it's what you do when you're arguing against a piece of legislation that has a fundamental foundation of fairness and decency and kind of just a values-based proposition. You can't argue those values, and so they don't. They argue all a bunch of ridiculous baloney over here, and they know that full well that senators are juggling hundreds of bills, and it's hard to wade through. So I'll give you some examples. When we did a task force, some of them are ridiculous. This was a task force about just the whole issue, the whole industry, whether it's appliances or electronic or tractors. And I remember a guy said, your coffee maker is going to be connected to the internet, right? And that's true. Some people now, I guess, you can push brew and their coffee maker starts because they push a button on their phone. That doesn't appeal to me. But for some people, that's true. And then he says, so your coffee maker is connected to the internet. It breaks, and you just take it to some guy down the street. And now your banking information is in jeopardy because you access your bank through your phone. I'm like, wow, okay, I guess, but I also take my car to be repaired and my phone connects to the car. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Or another guy came in from the Battery Association, and he had a whole dog and pony show. He flew with bags of batteries, and he proceeded to tell us how it's really important that you get the right battery because blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't me. It was somebody raised their hand. This was a few years ago when, remember, batteries in phones were exploding on planes, and it was pretty scary. And they were the manufactured installed batteries in the phones that somebody bought, right? We were like, wait, isn't there kind of this problem now? And there are kiosks in the mall for phones, and they are replacing batteries. And the manufacturer preventing that kiosk maybe from having the appropriate battery. So In fact, their argument was completely backward. It was just ridiculous, but meant to snowball it and make legislators go, oh God, this is so confusing. You know, they're in more specific to this bill. I know that you're hearing about MOUs between farmers and manufacturers, or between farmers and dealers, and between the industry at large wants to just say, we don't need laws, especially different laws in different states. We're handling this with MOUs, right? And that is asking quite a leap of faith from an industry that prides on planned obsolescence and making sure you don't buy an $8 valve and replace your washing machine. And in fact, the MOUs and what you're entertaining here are very similar. So when you pass this bill, then the MOUs are not necessary, and you won't have to depend on, you know, one particular brand coming forward and doing that, but rather protecting Vermonters in a broader sense. You're also hearing that, you know, maybe if we let just anybody fix their own tractor, they'll remove some of the safety features. I mean, maybe. I don't think that's where people are coming from. If they're motivated to do that, they probably can do that now if they're really motivated. But we've had regulators on engines for forever. I mean, I remember a neighbor of mine who had a go-kart, and it was much cooler than other go-karts because somehow they'd removed the regulator on the little gas-powered lawnmower engine that flew that thing around the neighborhood, right? I mean, we've had this basic issue in front of us for decades, and without like real catastrophe. In fact, it's sort of laughable. And and oftentimes, you know, I just don't think those are apples and oranges. I think, or comparable. I think they are completely separate. Whether or not you can get your tractor up and running, and whether or not you want to play with the emissions, is totally separate. Other than sometimes it's those emission things for a $4 part that are halting the computer in your tractor entirely and costing you a week of time when you would rather be out working. And in fact, this is why I love the bill you're talking about in terms of just the sort of equipment relevant in rural working life, because after all, just about all the farms are hitting the fields in a similar time span, right? And that's also the time span when we're watching people harvest in Massachusetts, right? And so the dealers that are the only ones that can come help you when you're stuck, they've kind of got the tractors are less active, let's say, for much of the year, and then for a few set of weeks they're going gangbusters, and that's when obviously problems happen. So there's a very real logistic issue. And you'll hear dealers say, well, we don't have the staff, that's part of the problem. Yeah, that is part of the problem, and that's why we need to be able to rely on Uncle Larry, who knows how to fix this stuff, and he just can't get the part, or he doesn't have the updated computer and all of that ridiculousness. So anyway, I could go on and on about this. I love this issue. I think it's fundamental. It hits on fairness. It hits on cost. It hits on self-reliance. And the last story I'll tell you is when I introduced this bill, and mine, the first one was everything. It was just all equipment that should be treated the same. You're looking at something much narrower. But all various industries would write me, and they would come from out of state, and so they didn't know the Vermont system. And I met at a national conference a guy who worked for Apple Computer, and somebody with me said, "Oh, I'd like you to meet Senator Pearson from Vermont." And this guy pulled back and he said, "Oh, I know you." And I thought, how does Apple Computer know me? Because they found this to be such a threat. And I frankly, that was a huge badge of honor. And you know, it just doesn't hold up. The scrutiny, and meanwhile, one of the co-founders of Apple has come forward and said that right to repair is fundamental, and that Apple Computer would never be the power that it is today without the ability to tinker. Anyway, the only other thing I'll say is all these industries would write letters and say, yeah, I've seen Senator Pearson, I've seen you've done this bill, but Caterpillar brand is different. You have to exclude Caterpillar, and all of these industries would make this plea to me. You've got to exclude home appliances. It's very different. And one that sort of spooked me was the medical devices, the MRIs, and like the high-tech medical people. They wrote me a letter and sort of said, you can't just trust repairing the MRI machines to anybody. And this caught my attention because I like to tinker with things, but I cannot imagine opening up the lid of an MRI and being like, I got this, right? And so I sort of thought to myself, maybe that one is something we would have to dance, lightly around. And of course, they all wrote to me thinking I could influence the bill after I'd introduced it. They didn't understand the Vermont system where you lose the power over your own bill. Within a week, I got a letter from UVM techs, from the people at UVM Hospital, UVMMC, that fixed the MRIs. And they said, thank you. Thank you. This is really important to us. We can fix all of this stuff. We're not allowed to. It costs us a lot of time and money while we wait for the people to come up from Boston to fix this equipment. Thank you for doing this. This is really important. It will actually make a difference to people's lives. I was quite stunned by that. But after all, we have a lot of people, even though I worry that we're losing these skills, that do know how to fix things. They're just being blocked by the corporate structure that is threatened by our ability, wants the profit center in quickly replacing equipment, wants the profit center in forcing you to go to the dealer to get repairs and parts. And that's why this is complicated, because you are threatening, you are challenging the power of very large entrenched corporate powers. But you should do it, and you should pass it knowing that voters have your back. And this is an easy one to sell, and just say, Uncle Larry knows how to fix this tractor. I trust him, and I don't want to wait 3 weeks for the authorized person to come up from God knows where to tell me what Uncle Larry told me yesterday.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. We've taken quite a lot of testimony in regards to, farm equipment and logging equipment. We visited a dealership where both John Deere was there as well as New Holland. And
Yep.
At the dealership, they told us how they had, like, I don't know, in all their dealerships, they had like $50 million in parts sitting on the shelves. But they had a relatively small repair shop. And they told us that the reason they had the small repair shop is because they didn't have the technicians to do all the work that had been requested. And so there was no need of having a great big shop if they couldn't hire anybody to work in there. As well as they have their parts manager, parts distributor guy set up so that if Farmer X calls in and and says, well, I'd like to get my tractor repaired and I've heard this little such and such a noise, that they can tell them what it might be and where it's located, so they can repair their own breakdown. But where they kind of objected was the emissions issues, that these tractors are set up with some pretty high-tech exhaust parts, and that if that's malfunctioning, it could do something to the tractor, as well as if they tinkered that up and disconnected it, it would be polluting, which isn't supposed to be happening. So it's kind of a mixed bag of testimony that we've heard, where the dealers are trying to help the owners figure out what's wrong with their rig so they can fix it themselves because they don't have the help to really go out and do the work anyway. So,
Yeah. I mean, if it was all as you're hearing from the dealers, then nobody would be testifying in support of this bill, right? I mean, and it's not to say, look, this comes from corporate headquarters. This strategy. This is not something that, the folks in St. Johnsbury are cooking up to drive profits. But at a fundamental level, the safety concerns, I think, get overblown. I mean, after all, I'm allowed to repair my brakes on my car and then drive a ton of steel down the road while the kids are in the crosswalk. I mean, we have this same kind of principles at play all over the place. And, we don't interrupt that freedom of choice when it comes to cars, by and large. But there's some interesting history on the automobile side where it's just much more straightforward that you can take it to your corner mechanic. And this is where the parallel, I think, comes in with tractors. For, I don't know, 10, 15 years, there were, the diagnosis. You get a little light on your dash, you don't know what's going on, you take your car in, they plug in a computer, and then the computer tells you what's going on. Computer that you plug in talks to the computer in your car. And if you had a Honda, you had to go to a place with the Honda computer. If you had a Toyota, you had to go to the Toyota. If you had a Ford, and there were all these different computers, and it made small mechanics crazy, and it made customers crazy because you had to know kind of how to navigate that. And it often meant you started with the dealer again, which is in many cases more expensive. In Massachusetts, they put this question of exactly this, the car diagnostics on the ballot. It passed overwhelmingly. There was then a follow-up in the legislature, and the automobile industry, all of them, came to the table and wrote an MOU. And now, starting, I think, model year 2018, all the diagnostics for all of the major car companies are the same computer. You can take so a mechanic buys one computer, and no matter what brand car comes in, they can plug it in. Okay. That was only brought about because of political pressure, people standing up to this system. And it's the same thing when it comes to tractors, because one of the hurdles is that you need to plug your John Deere computer into your John Deere tractor to figure out what's not working right. And there's not very many of those diagnostic pieces of equipment around, or you got to have a technician that can come out to the farm to do that. So if you advance this bill, what you could imagine happening is one person or a group of farms come together and buy the diagnostic piece of equipment and share it. And then they, Charlie down the road has a problem with his tractor. Oh, we'll call Larry. Larry's got the computer. And then you just saved yourself 10 days of time waiting for that first visit. So I guess, I don't know a ton about the industry of tractor repair. Okay. I mean, let's be clear. I mow my lawn and I'm proud of that. And that's about as far as I go. Okay. I don't even own a chainsaw, though I'm pretty good at using one. But at fundamental level, I own some equipment. If I have the skills myself, or I know somebody that has the skills, or somebody that hasn't been blessed by some corporate overlord knows how to fix it, and I want to give that person money, we ought to be able to do that. And until we just accept that premise, we're going to keep being very challenged by this. And this issue doesn't solve the workforce dynamic that you're talking about, Mr. Chair. But there's probably a lot of people that do know how to make these repairs that don't want to do it 8 to 4 every day working in a certain plant, but they have the skills and they could use them more easily if parts were available and they didn't have to go through all these legal hurdles and phone calls and blah, blah, blah to make sure that they were sort of playing by the rules set by John Deere and others.
Yeah. Are there questions from the committee? No? Irene?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Chris. Good to see you. Sorry I was late.
Nice to
We had
see you.
someone in yesterday talking about, not in Vermont, but he uses a drone to spray pesticides. And he mentioned that it might be problematic to have people fixing drones by themselves. Do you see any reason to carve out for any particular piece of equipment, such as aerial equipment or anything else? Did you ever run across that as you did this?
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants their own thing carved out. Everything is special.
Right.
And I just come back to the car over and over and over because you see people with a car jacked up in their driveway, and Lord knows what they're doing to the exhaust system, to the brakes, that have very, very clear and serious implications if it goes poorly. When you're administering pesticides, you're regulated and you are signing, you take responsibility to do that through regulators, I think, at the agency of ag. And so, the piece of equipment that you're using is secondary. You've said, I have the skills, I understand, I've got to stay away from water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How you administer that through the drone that may or may not have been fixed by cousin Larry is completely secondary. But it's, again, this swirl of scare tactics that's meant to throw you off this, because they can't really argue against just the very basic fundamental of why in the world I should not be able to own this piece of equipment, fix this piece of equipment that I own.
Well, that is one of the bigger issues is if you do own a piece of equipment, you want to tinker on it, so be it. I mean, there isn't anybody that shuts you down from working on it. It a lot of times, the older equipment was pretty straightforward. You open the hood on your car today and you don't see the motor. So all you see is a whole bunch of plastic stuff and maybe the dipstick to the oil pan sticking up out of that somewhere. But years ago, you could see your spark plugs and your exhaust pipe and carburetor and all that. But today, it's so convoluted in there that you don't see anything. And you go to change your oil today, or at least on my cars, and you have all this plastic junk underneath that you have to take down to even get to the oil plug. And it's a lot different now than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago. Like I said, we went to the tractor place last week or the week before. You walk up to the side of that tractor and you really didn't see a whole lot other than shields and covers and I mean, it takes a half a day to get into where the engine is. So it's a lot different working on equipment today than years ago. If I could buy a new truck with no warranty on it and save $3,000 or $4,000, I'd drive it out of the yard with no warranty whatsoever on it, knowing that either I or the mechanic, or between the two of us, we could get that running. And now today, when my son and his crew get new trucks, they buy a full bumper to bumper 5-year warranty for $15,000 or something like that, just protect themselves against getting in there and trying to take wires and afterburners. And I mean, there's everything in there that's packed in, you know, like sardines are in a can. And it's difficult. But we still have, you know, even right today, they have a right to tear their rig apart if they want and tinker on it. The diagnostic equipment for those trucks, it's like $5,000. And they don't fool with it. But some of the neighbor, you know, other guys we know, 2 or 3 of them have chipped in and bought it together. You know, rather than buying the extended warranty and all that, they try to do their own.
And this piece of equipment, sorry to interject, but just, you know, sometimes even if you replace a broken part, you need the computer to reset. You need the diagnostic equipment to reset the onboard computer, and they'll make it difficult to get that. And so this is all part of package of making sure that there's sort of this profit center after the sale to the same companies. And this bill doesn't change all of that overnight. I don't hear me saying that, but I do think it addresses some of the foundation of the dynamic that you're describing, and particularly since, you know, there are intense periods where you really got to run your tractor to make the economics of the farm go, and especially in this time of dicey weather when it could be really a problem if you can't get a crop in before a big deluge of rain, whatever it is. I think there's an argument to say that we should give people as much flexibility as we can. Do we think this is going to solve all of those issues? No. But at its heart, this is a move in the right direction and back towards a self-reliance and you know, so anyway, I guess I'm repeating myself, but I do think there are some interruptions, and it comes to, and they've tied together with the complexity of the computer systems, and they would have you believe, well, it's just more complicated now and it needs to be done in-house. And it is obviously more complicated. There's much more computers going on, but you're still firing a spark plug and a piston is moving as a result. And there are, you know, at its heart, there's still some skills out there that I think we risk losing the less we move back to that kind of old self-reliance.
Yeah. Anything else for Chris? No. Anything else, Chris, that you'd like to leave us with?
No, but you've made my morning. Thank you, everybody. Call on me anytime. I'm happy to sound off if you'd like.
Well, we appreciate you giving us your time, and thanks a lot for your thoughts in regards to this.
Thank you very much. Good luck with your deliberations.
Yeah.
Thank you. See you, Chris.
Take care.
Bye.
So, Nelson has not called in, so Justin is here. If you want to go to him.
Justin.
Sure.
Yeah.
Bye.
Jeff, come right up.
All right. Good. Morning.
So you're taking Nelson's place?
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for having me.
No. No, go ahead.
Sure.
And we'll introduce ourselves. Go ahead.
Yeah, Brian Collmore, representing the Rutland District.
Hi, Irene Runner, the North, including Fairbanks.
Brian Campion, Bennington District. I'm Rich Westman, Wayne.
And Bobby Starr from Orleans County.
Wonderful.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Justin Culver from the Attorney General's Office. I'm Chief of our Environmental and Public Protection Division, which includes our Consumer Protection Unit. And that's primarily the hat I'll be wearing this morning when I testify. And Senator Campion, I think we overlapped in Bennington during the PFAS case, which I helped work on. Good to see you again as well. Thank you for having me, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'll start first by saying that I appreciated former Senator Pearson's eloquent remarks. I think he touched on some principles that I would highlight as well around consumer fairness. He spoke to principles like fair competition, fair access for consumers, and those are principles that our office, obviously, we not only believe in those, we enforce those under our Consumer Protection Act. So I'll start there. I'll start by saying our office does support the bill. It's H81. I don't have specific word changes or concerns to raise. I'm here to walk through our general consumer perspective and possibly answer a few questions with the caveat that, again, I'll probably be limited in my role as a consumer protection attorney. So again, we support the bill. Our office supported federal right to repair legislation or federal efforts in this area. Last year, we joined a multi-state letter to Congress that was joined by over 35 states. So with this bill, we think it's good for consumers. We think it's good for fair competition. Both of those are dual purposes under the Consumer Protection Act, again, which our office enforces. First, I'll speak to fair competition. There's a principle around preventing monopolies, and that goes back to the very history of consumer protection laws over 100 years ago. The very first Federal Trade Commission Act, the Sherman Act, were about preventing monopolies. One of the modern cases from the 1990s, the US Supreme Court found that Kodak, even in the 1990s, was still creating monopolies by tying the sale of parts to the sale of service. And that was a violation of what's known as the anti-tying provision of the Magnuson-Moss Act. So Kodak got in trouble for that. They were limiting parts and sales and service altogether, creating a monopoly. And that's similar to what this bill does. This bill is trying to prevent that kind of anti-tying by preventing companies from having control over parts, repair equipment, and so forth. I'm not suggesting that in the absence of legislation, there is a current unfair or monopolistic market right now for ag or forestry equipment, only that the general principles of consumer law certainly support what you're considering. Next, I can speak to some of the consumer benefits that could result from this bill. I believe there was a report in your materials from the Federal Trade Commission, which outlined a lot of the consumer benefits, starting with the lowered repair costs for farmers. It would allow farmers whose equipment is particularly reliant on digital components to be able to make their own on-the-spot repairs. That would bring costs down for them, or would allow them to have closer, maybe independent repair shops provide repairs and service for them. That would also drive down costs. And that's important, especially in a time right now where we're seeing high inflation, the cost of food is increasing. And so this would help farmers to avoid lengthy disruptions. All of those benefits were noted by the FTC report, and those are benefits that our office would support as well. And then lastly, I know that the current draft of the bill would make violating the bill what's known as a per se violation of the Consumer Protection Act. That's section 4053 of the current version. It says if you fail to comply with this law, you will be violating the Consumer Protection Act. It will give our office the authority to enforce that. And that's all well and fine. We see that provision in many consumer laws and bills across the Vermont statutes. So we certainly support that. So those are my general consumer principles. I think there may have been a question around pricing that I'm happy to speak to. I know that the current bill, section 4052C, talks about setting a price that is quote fair, and so long as it does not discourage fair pricing.
Fair and reasonable.
Fair and reasonable pricing, exactly. So I know that it doesn't define the price, it doesn't set a ceiling or a cap, and that seems appropriate. I can say that fair pricing or unfair pricing, those are not defined legal terms, and that's okay. There can be price gouging as a defined legal term, and that's where you have a state of emergency, you have essential goods, so obviously that's not this. There can be general unconscionable pricing, that's usually a contract law principle. There are lots of cases that talk about unconscionable pricing, but there's no fixed formula for when a price becomes so high that it's legally unconscionable. It's always a test by each case scenario. And then there can also be price fixing, and that comes from antitrust law as well. And I think there's a question about price fixing, and I can speak to the Federal Trade Commission definition of price fixing. And price fixing, this comes from the Federal Trade Commission. It is an agreement, written, verbal, or inferred from conduct among competitors to raise or lower, maintain or stabilize prices among themselves. Under antitrust law, companies have to set their own prices separately. They can't collude together. And that's the essential definition of price fixing. It's an agreement or conspiracy among competitors.
That works in all pricing.
So that principle would apply to exactly.
So why, I don't wanna get you off your thoughts, but if you drive up in Burlington area, every gas station, I'm not gonna say everyone, but about everyone has the exact same price. And you know that one person doesn't own them all. There's 2 or 3 on them. And nobody says anything about that price fixing. But we, just from an amateur point of view, it's always been strange to me why you drive by 10 of them and 9 of them have got the same price. And nobody ever says anything about them price fixed. Is there any reason for that?
It's a good question and a good example, and I can say our office does get complaints about that. We are aware of that, so I think there is awareness and discussion around it. I am aware of a public inquiry by Senator Sanders' office to look into that problem specifically, I think particularly in Chittenden County, to see if it was collusion or price fixing. So what I can say is it relates back to the definition. If there was proof of conspiracy to fix those prices together, you'd be able to allege price fixing, but without proof of that conduct, I think that's where the struggle begins.
See, we had, as you heard, we went to a dealership last week or the week before. And did any of you count the number of stores that was on that little page? Must have been 10 or 15.
I was gonna say 12, yeah.
12. But the same company owns, most of Vermont dealerships, some in New Hampshire and Maine. And they said that they had, between the group, $50 million tied up in the fire show. And they told us, what the floor plan was and what it cost to keep those. And so I would expect those dealerships, it wouldn't matter if you went to the one in Maine or went to the one in Burlington or Montpelier, the same part would cost roughly the same from any one of those stores. But they are, it's like some car dealerships, they're only multi dealerships and years ago, you'd have a competitor that owns every one of them and it was competitive, but they're commingling.
Exactly. They're conglomerating, they're consolidating. Certainly see that. We see businesses consolidating that can drive prices up, and that can even lead to legislative reform of setting price caps or ceilings. That certainly happens in the healthcare industry. I think states are starting to set price caps on insulin because of that. Exactly. So what I can speak to this bill is that we don't see, we see fair pricing as an appropriate use, and I wouldn't flag any concern with that.
Yep, good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Those are probably my prepared remarks. I thought maybe there was a question about the MOU that I'm happy to answer, but I can let the committee ask.
We've had questions come up about it, whether it's enforceable or not, and and there is I think a 6-month time limit. It could get revisited in 6 months. I don't know if you had any Do you have comment
Sure.
on?
Yeah, I can speak to the MOU from a sort of a high level, and I also want to caveat that we would also defer to your ledge counsel, of course, their legal advice and expertise for you for all of these questions and points, so please consult with them, of course. So the MOU we're talking about, I think, is the January 2023 one
Yeah,
between the American Farm Bureau Federation and John Deere.
yeah,
Right, so I'll note that the MOU by its own terms, it's called a quote, voluntary private sector commitment rather than legislative or regulatory measures. The American Farm Bureau is not a government entity, they're a nonprofit advocacy group. The MOU requires manufacturer, in this case John Deere, to offer numerous equipment, access, tools, information. It refers to farmers as the quote, intended beneficiaries of the MOU. And it says the ABF is going to work to discourage state laws that impose any greater obligations in the MOU, and that if new right to repair state laws are passed with a greater obligation, then the manufacturer, John Deere, can withdraw from that MOU. There are no penalties or enforcement mechanisms in the MOU. It's entirely voluntary. So our high-level points of that, those principles that are in the MOU. First, again, it's not a rule or a regulation. So it's not something that our office would enforce. The ABF is not the American Farm Bureau, they're not a government entity either. Which means there are no legal obstacles to this body passing its own right to repair law. If the MOU were federal mechanism, or if the American Farm Bureau were a federal entity, we might be worried about conflicting obligations. But because it's essentially a private voluntary agreement, we don't see any obstacles to this body passing its own right to repair law. If John Deere failed to comply with the MOU, again, our office wouldn't enforce that directly. It also doesn't provide any direct remedy under the MOU for farmers. At most, maybe a farmer could bring what's known as a third-party beneficiary claim. That's kind of a contract law principle that they were, and the MOU does say that farmers are the intended beneficiaries of the MOU. So it's possible that if the manufacturer failed to comply with it, a farmer could bring their own breach of contract as an intended beneficiary. Not entirely clear, they would still have to prove other elements of contract law like consideration, but it's possible that the MOU gives the farmer potential rights. Farmer might have potential consumer protection rights too if John Deere was deceptive or misleading in any of its dealings with the farmer. There could be general consumer protection remedies, but the MOU again by itself does not provide any direct enforcement or penalties. And certainly if this body were to enact H81, well, that would make it a state statute that makes it enforceable under Vermont law. It gives our office authority to enforce it. It gives direct penalties, remedies, and enforcement mechanisms for Vermont farmers.
do you see where H81 goes beyond the MOU or vice versa?
I probably don't have the technical expertise to speak to that as to whether the specifications around equipment access and repair is more burdensome. I think we probably have to defer to ledge counsel, maybe other experts who know the different components of which information or diagnostics have to be provided. But even then, I would say it wouldn't raise a legal obstacle to impose greater obligations than the MOU if this body wanted to do that.
Questions from the committee? I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding is this MOU is just between the American Farm Bureau and John Deere, whereas H81 would be much more broad.
Correct. It would require any company doing business in Vermont that provides agricultural or forest equipment to comply with the requirements of H81. So it speaks to the industry, not any particular manufacturer.
And one of the, I guess, exceptional cases was that there's manure spreaders that come from Quebec. Would they be subject to this new law if equipment is sold here, or only if? Or I guess only if it's sold here as opposed to someone who buys one and imports it. Do you know how that?
Yeah, it
Check that.
sort of speaks to the territoriality or the jurisdictional reach of the bill of which
Yes.
companies are doing business in Vermont. So I think that is a test of looking at the company. Are they intentionally directing their sales and products to Vermont? Do they have a website that's accessible to Vermont farmers? But generally, the test would be if you're doing business in Vermont, you would be subject to our laws.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Yeah, but if a farmer went to Canada and went to Quebec and bought a piece of equipment, then they wouldn't be subject to this right to repair law, right?
Well, it's possible. I have to give the lawyer's answer, if it does depend. If that Canadian company perhaps had a website that was accessible and advertised to Vermonters, sure, they might actually be considered doing business just like, a company headquartered in California that doesn't have a store in Vermont, but has a website where you can order equipment online, would still be subject to our Vermont laws.
Yeah. Cause living around the border, you do go over there and buy things from time to time because it's closer to Sherbrooke than it is to Berlin.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't know if they advertise or promote anything down in the States, but I know they have, dealerships like Night Trucks or Kenworth in Sherbrooke. And many
Big
times,
dealerships.
many times you can't get the part in Burlington.
Mhm.
So you call up there, we got 3 of those sitting on the shelf.
Sure.
And, in an hour you're there and back in 2, so.
Sure.
But anyways, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Fair. There was an attorney that had been flown in from, or that flew himself in from Montana who spoke to this. And bristled at the fair, unreasonable, fair customer, whatever, I can't find it. Language that's in here, you did mention that earlier, as
Fair and rate.
not defined, thank you, that it's not defined, but that didn't strike me reading it itself as an onerous type of thing, and I'm just wondering, maybe from your experience with laws like this, is that something that puts an undue burden on them, or, is it pretty easy to prove that you're charging a fair and reasonable cost? As a vendor?
I can speak to the first part, which seems pretty reasonable. As to proving it, that would probably be where that's hard to define, because as I was saying, fair pricing isn't a defined legal term. And so what I can say, it doesn't rise to any of the other defined legal concepts around price fixing or unconscionable pricing. And that's a good thing, we think.
So it's kind of like, when you see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It certainly doesn't appear to be onerous or violative of the unfair pricing schemes that we see.
Okay. Thank you.
So, anything else?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Sure, happy to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
No.
He was my colleague, but. Well, she checked. Christine just checked with him. She sent in the number and then checked with him, and did you hear back? No.
Well, something may happen.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else that wants to testify in regards to H 81?
Right.
Well, you did try to reach Richard?
Yeah, I gave him the information yesterday and I know he got it, but he hasn't been responding this morning, so
Yeah.
something might have come up.
Well, why don't we take a little break?
Stevie Simpson.
See if he gets, you can keep trying to get hold of him. They will come back and, and